now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, an associate with us at the London Policing College. It's Polly Harrar. She's the founder and CEO of the Harrar project, a registered charity supporting South Asian women. She's the joint chair of the London Harmful Practices Group, a member of the Home Office National Oversight Group and the Forced Marriage Partnership Board. In other words, she is an expert in her field. Some of you will have sat in earlier on Polly's workshops that she ran during October, centering on harmful practices. I'm delighted that Polly's got the time to be back with us today to give us an overview of that, but also what the future holds. So hopefully, Polly, you're there and ready to go.
Thank you, Bob. Hope everyone can hear me. So thank you again for inviting me back to this very important session. I'd like to focus a little bit around the policing response to harmful practices. And to do so, I just want to initially go through what we learned from our workshops previously, and then look at how that can be applied to the future of policing. Now, as Bob's kindly introduced, I do co-chair the London Harmful Practices Working Group. And for those of you who may not be familiar with this, it is a platform of organisations, partners, stakeholders and experts that have been driven from across London to work on harmful practices. And this particular platform is supported through the Met Police. And in previous sessions, I've explained how this fits in, not just with the local policing response, but also on a national level, where the information and the work that we do feeds up to the NPCC and up beyond that within the Home Office. So I also, as has been mentioned, I'm the CEO of a charity called the Harrar Project, which is a PME specialist support service for women, particularly South Asian women, who've been affected by harmful practices and abuse. And this includes areas that often require a policing response, such as forced marriage, honour-based abuse, FGM, and abuse linked to faith and belief. So very much with both of those hats, I'm delighted to be here again. So for those who attended the previous two workshops that I presented at, you may recall that we discussed how policing across the world has significantly been impacted by the increase in levels of domestic abuse and harmful practices. So I'm going to start with a brief overview of some of these discussions and then move on to the future of policing. But please do at this point use the chat function to raise any questions or make any comments, because I'm hoping to have some time for a Q&A. And you'll notice that I'm not using any PowerPoint slides. I think a morning of slides has been fantastic, so you'll forgive me for not producing further slides, but I do hope to have a video to show you at the end of this particular session. So let's start with what we know. Well, what we do know is that where governments adopted a stay-at-home response to curb the spread of COVID-19, that this created a perfect storm, where perpetrators have concentrated their targeting of victims behind closed doors. And mostly it's directed towards women and girls, although not exclusively. And this has in itself resulted in isolation being imposed by their abusers. Indeed, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has called for measures to address what he refers to, and I quote, a horrifying global surge in domestic violence, which has seen calls to services more than double. In fact, in the UK, calls to domestic abuse services were reported to be 150% increased. And what we've also seen is that it's left the police, and again, I'll quote from the UN Secretary General, overwhelmed and understaffed. And this is a global position. So where it's clear that there is a need for policing to adapt to respond to domestic abuse and harmful practices, particularly during the pandemic, emerging data does show that significant increase in crimes and violence against women and girls, which was reflected in our previous session, where we heard from UK and international officers as to some of the challenges that they face in responding to this high harm, high volume crime, and also how the levels of demand to respond to these types of calls far exceed policing capacity and resources. And this has left many victims to face the abuse alone and perpetrators to go unchallenged. Indeed, during the Ebola pandemic, we saw women and girls endure multiple forms of violence, including trafficking, child marriage, sexual exploitation and abuse. And this acts as a stark warning as to the potential trajectory of gendered crimes under COVID. So since the first wave of the pandemic, we have learned that the scale of this issue is far higher than we anticipated, and that the true impact may not truly be realised for many years to come. But we also heard that given the sheer volume of calls, many officers were overwhelmed, and for many, it was the first time that they dealt with quite often highly complex cases, which supports the need for further budget, education and continued training. We also explored how working with non-statutory services and NGOs and charities has afforded the police an invaluable yet intensive insight into cultural concerns, conflicts and resolution. Now, from my own experience working with several police forces across the UK during the first lockdown on harmful practices, cases around forced marriage and honour-based abuse, having that critical friends, that expert advice has really helped to shape not only the investigation, but also the safeguarding and the interaction and the engagement of the victim with the process. So really valuable lessons had definitely been learned. At the same time, officers are being deployed to manage, as we've heard, protests, public disorders, mass gatherings, and at the same time, they still need to prioritise on national security. So it brings into question the priority around domestic abuse and harmful practices within policing. So although many the police have been afforded new powers, they too come with challenges of enforcement and manpower and community trust. My colleague Roger Gome discussed earlier the need to develop strategic, tactical and operational responses that when it comes to community safety and security, a very important part of policing, that we need to look at the details and the impact of COVID-19 on vulnerable groups in order to achieve a better policing, inform a better policing response. We also know that domestic abuse and harmful practices are not a new crisis, and that its emergence is often centred in gendered inequality, unconscious bias, and male or power dominant structures. We also know that offenders have learnt to adapt in changing environments, and as such, the policing needs to adapt to evolve to new and emerging crime types. In addition to exploring the key concepts, impacts and motivations of harmful practices, we also looked at what we call the A to Z of crimes associated with harmful practices and abuse, and the need to disrupt, intercept and prevent high harm repeat offenders while still constantly working under the homicide prevention mode. When we looked at the figures, which remain shocking, we know that since the pandemic, more women have been killed due to abuse than in non-COVID times. In London, approximately 16 domestic homicides were reported in the first 3 months alone. But we also know that this is just the tip of the iceberg and that this pattern is being mirrored all over the world. We have already seen an increase in calls for police assistance, where the pandemic has been cited as a contributing or situational factor. And by this I mean where a partner may decide not to self-isolate, placing women and children at deliberate risk of infection. In cases, in an increase in the use of drugs and alcohol, leading to an increase in physical harm, neglect and petty crime. And the prevention of access to medical assistance by using the virus to instill fear and further isolate victims. We've also seen how abusers have sabotaged home working by not contributing to childcare or removing the equipment or devices needed to maintain employment, as well as the use of controlling coercive tactics to make separation or leaving abuse difficult, given the fears, particularly in the first lockdown, as to being made homeless, and particularly where shelters and support services were restricted. So I guess what I'm saying is the list goes on, but what it does do is offers us an insight into the changing perpetrator behaviours and the new risks that we have not previously seen at this level. This has also further been frustrated where the courts were closed, and it's already created a significant backlog in delivering justice. And this is particularly relevant where case reviews meant balancing the rights of the victim or survivor against the human rights of the offender not to remain in remand for an indefinite period until a hearing date has been released. And again, ever-changing restrictions to national and local lockdowns has impacted on the educational attainment disparities, particularly for those within low income households. Redundancies and closures to entire sectors and for certain communities who have been identified as being at greater risk of affection has also played a major factor. So the workshop also focused on the tools and the approaches that can be applied to ensure a victim-centred safeguarding response. And we looked at perpetrator profiling through the use of evidence-based data matrices and community-based intelligence to identify offender types, hotspots, and emerging challenges. And this has very much been something that through the London Harmful Practices Working Group, we have continued to maintain since the very beginning of lockdown through our COVID-19 calls with our partners to have a better sense of what's happening on the ground, to gather that community intelligence and therefore to allow the police to deploy the resources in the areas that are most at need. We also looked at the case of Banaz Mahmood, which highlighted the absolute need to ensure a policing response reflects the devastating cultural impacts that harmful practices can have. And we are aware that there are countless similar stories and cases around similar to Banaz globally and also right here in the UK. And that whilst we have come some way in order to better understand these hidden harms, lessons still need to be learned and more importantly applied. We looked at the one chance rule, that you may only have one chance to save a life, and that how you respond, if you respond, can make all the difference to a victim of abuse. And we cannot let cultural insensitivities get in the way, but instead we need to apply professional curiosity and ensure a victim-centred approach is taken where possible. And this was something that was certainly prevalent in the chats during the workshops around having more cultural awareness and not allowing perpetrators to use that against police in order to make further inquiries. So what we also know is that the police can't tackle these issues alone and that they only play one part in the wider criminal justice system. And this is why collective responsibility is required if we are to fully address the short, medium and long-term needs of survivors and victims, as well as securing successful convictions. But it hasn't all been doom and gloom. And yes, the pandemic has posed many challenges and continues to do so, but it's also created new opportunities. And it's through those opportunities that we can help to shape the future of policing beyond COVID-19. So to start with, like the universal recognition of the role of health services such as the NHS, like never before, police has been afforded profile, powers and praise, not just from governments, senior officers and officials, but also within the communities where operational responses are most felt. So through increased visibility, policing continues to play a critical role in these uncertain times. And yes, more can still be done, but where the old rule book has been thrown out the window and COVID has prevented the use of pre-existing responses and strategies and tactics, officers have adapted and continue to attend domestic abuse calls above any personal risk and to create and apply positive action. And I think this goes a long way to building trust and legitimacy of police. Extra funding was also afforded to many organisations and frontline professionals, as well as PPE for the police. Hotels were repurposed to manage the overspill of domestic abuse provisions and for vulnerable groups such as homeless and for refugees. The number of online conferences, webinars, trainings and platforms such as this addressing domestic abuse and harmful practices emerged almost overnight, creating safe spaces, educational inputs and an opportunity to share good practice. And equally, globally, governments are constantly responding to the scale of this issue, with many rolling out national campaigns, such as here in the UK with the You Are Not Alone campaign through the Home Office. And partnerships with NGOs and communities has also led to an increase in the creation of what we call safe spaces, whether they are physical or virtual spaces for victims of abuse to be able to access support. Mobile phone apps and online reporting, as we heard earlier, has also been on the increase. So it really highlights that technology and social media has played its part and may continue to do so in the future. Research has also already been undertaken through the pandemic to further look at the role of policing, to include officers' understanding of domestic abuse, increase in safeguarding responses, and examining confidence in the police, and to create a rapid police response. And there is links to some of that research that is due to be published very shortly that we can share at the end of this session as well. So data continues also to be collated to recognise key patterns of offending, first-time offenders, and lessons learnt from policing responses of the first lockdown, and of course the use of police records to target prolific offenders. So we also see that for the first time, the UK government has introduced official statistics on honour-based abuse offences in England and Wales. And these figures will be published on the 16th of December at the gov.uk website. And this has been something that we've been calling for quite some time through the Home Office. So it's really encouraging to see that these figures are finally being published. I also wanted to take this opportunity to share with you a new initiative that was launched this week, which has been developed through working with the Met Police through the London Harmful Practices Working Group, and that is the Schools Charter. Now, this is a pledge by schools to take a zero tolerance approach to harmful practices through the delivery of training and inputs by working closely with the third sector and professionals, and to ensure disclosures and information is reported in accordance with existing frameworks, but also to encourage reporting and disclosures. So in addition to this, the Met have also developed guidance for schools and colleges to allow for schools to better prepare for addressing crimes that may affect young people and children. And it's through the partnership of the working group and our additional partners and stakeholders, including government departments, as well as the Met schools officers, that we hope that the charter and the guidance will be adopted in every school in the UK. But we know that we couldn't just do that on our own, and it was really important to reflect the partnership approach, particularly where we saw during the pandemic the closure of schools, the vulnerability of those children that are most at risk being out of sight. And so very much this is a progressive move to look at future-proofing the protection and safeguarding of young people. So to conclude, whilst we don't know what we don't know, it's clear that there is a need for further training to recognise cultural awareness and how unconscious bias embedded in gender inequality can greatly increase the risk of victim vulnerability and reduce the trust in police through problematic organisational and cultural prejudice. However, a new collaborative approach has been actualised during lockdown, and it's my hope that this will go on to lead to better information sharing, shared resources, and positive outcomes for victims and survivors. Now, no one's totally immune to this dark reality of abuse, but we have started to learn, we have started to adapt and to respond at lightning speed. And it's my hope that the focus on abuse and harmful practices will continue to play a critical role in the future of policing. So I would welcome an opportunity to answer your questions and hear any of your comments and observations and ideas going forward, particularly on the policing response in country for those participants, to see how harmful practices and domestic abuse will be looked at in the future. But before I do so, I wanted to share a short video that has been created by the West Midlands Police, where they organised what we call a flash mob at Birmingham New Street Station to raise awareness of forced marriages. Now, this video has received over 1 million views so far, and it really highlights and shows positively how the police can creatively engage with communities and raise awareness of harmful practices. So Daisy, if you don't mind, if it's possible to play the video. Thank you.